We've seen that in the United States, there are demonstrations against the policy in Gaza. At the same time, the Biden administration, House and Senate, they don't seem to understand what's going on really with these new movements in the United States. And how do you see the situation right now in the United States? Do you see these movements increasing? Do you see that the government is finding some sort of manner to control everything, to manage it? How do you see the situation right now?
Well, Nima, these student demonstrations on university campuses could not be more important. Okay, we speak today on the anniversary of the Kent State University massacre in 1970. So do the math, 54 years ago, at the height of the Vietnam disturbances, students in those days up in arms against this endless war in Vietnam, and many of them having, well, as we say, skin in the game. They could be sent to Vietnam. They didn't want that, okay? So they had a personal stake in all this, and they'd rather be put in prison than be sent off to Vietnam, okay? Now, what's different this time? This time, these students are acting out of altruistic and also patriotic motives, okay? They don't like people being killed. They don't like genocide. They abhor the notion that our country is supporting, is enabling, is arming the Israeli forces to do genocide. Do they have a personal stake in this? No, there's no draft. Nobody's going to be sent to Ukraine, or the worst that will happen, they'll be put in jail for a night or two, okay? So what's the deal here? They have no personal stake in this. They have no real jeopardy. And so they're out there in an altruistic way saying, look, we're America. We're speaking as the moral voice for America. Duty, honor, country. Well, that used to be a motto of West Point, but they changed that now. They've literally changed that now, although it's been evolving, eroding for decades. And so we're it, and we're going to stay here because, number one, we want a ceasefire. Number two, we don't want to be intimidated in terms of our First Amendment rights to free speech. And number three, we want to stop the genocide. Now, what kind of problem does this make for Joe Biden and his administration? A very big problem, because more and more the youth that almost instinctively voted Democratic are no longer going to do that. Besides, he's lost critical support in some of the really important states in the Midwest. And if he thinks just about the election, he's between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Does he let, and let's face it, he can prevent the Israeli leaders from furthering the genocide in Rafah, in South Gaza. He can prevent that with a simple telephone call. That's fact. Now, if he doesn't, and the Israeli leaders go ahead with the notion that it's far better to ask for forgiveness after the fact than permission before the fact, which is very often the way they operate, well, they're going to do it. And then what's Biden going to do? Is he going to take off those sunglasses and say, "Oh my God, I asked Tony Blinken to tell him no, don't do that." And Blinken went there how many times? Well, he went there 7 times now, and he told Mr. But Israel, it's his own country, and there's a lot of support in Congress, and there's a lot of support in the military-industrial complex for Israel, whatever it does. So what are we going to do? Now, if that happens, will there be armed conflict in a wider sense? I say there will be. Hezbollah up in the north, to the north of Israel. is not going to be able to watch this without making a lot more trouble for Israel than it has heretofore. Similarly, the Houthis, the Houthis, together with the UN, the International Court of Justice, are just as determined to prevent genocide or to exact on those who perpetrate genocide a heavy price. So the Houthis are going to be more active in the Red Sea. They have all manner of capabilities to wreak havoc, not only on Israeli ships, but with those who trade with the Israelis. The Israeli economy is going down. So I don't know what's going to happen. The smart people say Netanyahu is going to go ahead anyway. There are some voices who say, no, he'll listen to reason this time, partly because the celebrated IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are not really up to it. They can't wipe Hamas out of Rafah. They can just kill a lot of people. Will they do that? Well, we have leading Israeli politicians saying, sure, we can do that. And if we get too many prisoners, we'll just shoot the ones that have been there for a while and put the new ones in, take their place. These are people in the governing and in the guiding for the war leadership of Israel. So long-winded answer, Biden's going to have to decide whether it's better politically for him. Obviously, it doesn't seem as though he's troubled by the fact that people get killed. So politically, looking toward November, can he afford to lose hundreds of thousands of young people who just don't like the notion that the United States enables genocide and could stop it? Is he prepared to do that? Or will he try to think of some other stratagem to restrain Netanyahu? And it's really, really simple. All he has to do is get on the phone and say, not one more rifle, much less one more missile, will come to you if you decimate those 1 million+ people in Rafah.
Ray, we've learned that Chinese are reporting that Palestinian factions, Hamas and Fatah, met in Beijing for in-depth, candid dialogue and made encouraging progress. I'm saying the same thing that Chinese are talking about, encouraging progress in reconciliation talks. We've seen that what China did with Iran and Saudi Arabia. Right now, they're doing the same between these two groups, Hamas and Fatah, for the benefit of Palestinians, I think. And how do you see the role of China that is changing? They were playing in the background, and we see right now in the forefront of these changes that are happening in the Middle East.
China has indeed assumed a more active role. Xi Jinping visit Western Europe or Central Europe, France, Hungary, and Serbia, if memory serves. What's that all about? Well, it's about China coming into its own in a diplomatic sense. They already, as you said, encouraged and enabled a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's quite an achievement, okay? And now they're getting Hamas and the PLO or the Fatah together to see if they can work out something more sensible. Now, this has been tried before, 2005, 2006. It didn't work, mostly because Fatah, after Arafat died, was nothing but a very corrupt organization doing mostly the bidding of the Israeli authorities. Hamas won the election in 2006, hands down, okay? So Hamas is much more popular. Hamas is riding high, despite some losses in Gaza. It's worth noting that if memory serves, about a month and a half ago, the Russians also welcomed a delegation from Fatah and Hamas talking together in Moscow. So these are unprecedented achievements given the fact that a war is raging right now. And sure, this will give some real energy to the notion that, well, if there's going to be a Palestinian state, we're going to have to find some way to cooperate and forget about all the money that came to us from the U.S. and the UN through Ramallah and the PLO, the PLA, whatever. So it's going to be an adjustment for the Palestinians, for the Hamas and PLA leaders, but it's going to have to come. And how delayed it will be, that's hard to say. But Hamas is not giving up. Even prominent U.S. Professors and other statesmen are saying, look, you're not going to eliminate Hamas. I guess Panetta out there in California actually said that, forget about it, you're not going to eliminate Hamas. So you can eliminate Palestinians, and then maybe after killing another million or expelling them somehow, then you can go after Hamas in a more considered way. But that's not going to achieve much. Meanwhile, the U.S. has to worry about Biden's re-election chances, and as I say, that's a real dilemma. Last thing about Xi Jinping. Now, when Tony Blinken went off to Beijing in the wake of Janet Yellen, who was yelling at the Chinese for overproduction, surplus production. You're producing too many things, and that's hurting our economy. So you got to stop that. Now, Blinken doubles down and says, you are helping the Russians, and the Russians need your help on the battlefield in Ukraine. We want you to stop that. And if you don't stop, there'll be consequences. Read sanctions on your banks and all. Hello, the U.S. still doesn't get it. We talked a little bit before about a juvenile disorder called exceptionalism. Well, that's what we're seeing in this Blinken visit to Beijing. And Xi Jinping uncharacteristically said to Blinken's face, and it was on video, look, you can make promises, but then you don't follow through on them. This time, let's follow through on what you say you're going to do. You say you're going to do something, and then you don't do it. It's very undiplomatic. So what I'm saying here is you got Russia and China joined as never before at the hip. And when they interfere or when they get involved in Middle Eastern matters, this is a first, and they're working in parallel. Witness the fact that both, again, if memory serves, both Moscow and Beijing hosted visits from these two Palestinian factions, and that's that's really unusual. And if they look toward Moscow for help in this, it will eventually come, not right away, but only after the U.S. realizes that supporting the Israeli leaders in the kind of temper, the kind of tone that they adopt now is really kind of not going to win them an election. And you could see the tenor of Israeli remarks redounding to those senators, for example, in our country, who receive lots of payments from AIPAC and who follow very strictly the Israeli line. What's his name? Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Okay, 2 days ago, he said, these demonstrators, if you're caught behind a traffic backup there and you're near a bridge, take the law into your own hands, get out of that car and throw those demonstrators over the bridge. A senator, a United States senator. And then he says, some of these demonstrators, they glue their hands to the pavement or to vehicles, and and it hurt. Oh, peeling off all that skin, that will really hurt. Do it anyway, and make sure that they understand what we do in Arkansas. And that's the senator of the United States adopting the same tone that comes out of the Israeli leaders. First and foremost, the people right next to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is in the position where he has to listen to them And whether he can cease and desist on what he wants to do in Rafah is really questionable. Even if Biden called him up and said, no more arms if you go into Rafah and kill lots of people, Netanyahu probably will say, yeah, he wants to be able to say, he told me that, I'll do it, and then I'll ask for forgiveness. I'm not going to ask for permission. That's the way the Israelis operate, and it's been just fine for them operating that way because of American deference to Israeli interests.
Ray, there is a new poll that shows that 58% of Israelis are in favor of immediate resignation of Netanyahu. And in your opinion, if something happens, some changes happen in Israel, are we gonna have a even more radical government in Israel, or we gonna have some sort of more rational government in Israel?
I think the former. It will be more radical. Netanyahu, for all his faults, has been, if you can believe it, a moderating force on these really far out rightist people that are helping him reign in Israel. So 68%, that oddly is the same percentage that was in a poll a month ago saying 68% of Israeli people want to exterminate the rest of the Palestinians in Gaza. Whoa. So there's sort of a disconnect here. 68% want to exterminate the rest of the Palestinians in Gaza, and 68% don't like Netanyahu. Okay. Well, Netanyahu is going to stay in power as long as he can. He'll make whatever compromises he has to make with these hard rightists. Okay. And that means probably an invasion or terrific air attacks on Rafah. So even if he goes, you're going to have a government that's not listening to anybody, who thinks it can depend on American support no matter what, or the words used in the Ukrainian imbroglio, for as long as it takes. And he has precedent behind him to believe that, because that's the way the U.S. has always acted. Just once did the U.S. stand up and say no, and that was way back in 1956, when the French and the British and the Israelis tried to take over the Suez Canal without telling Eisenhower. So they thought, well, we'll seek forgiveness. We'll just go ahead. We won't ask for permission. And Eisenhower said, nothing doing. Pull those troops out of there. And they did. Now, that was when a person like Eisenhower had a basic moral sense and a political sense to prevent the kind of fractionalism in the Middle East for the longer term. And of course, that's precisely what we got, even though Britain and France took tail and pulled out, and Israeli as well. Not too many years later, 1967, so it's a 50 to 11 years later, you had the Israelis attacking Syria, attacking Egypt, attacking the forces that they later admitted were no threat to them. Menachem Begin, former premier, former prime minister, said in the United States, look, we have to be honest, those Egyptian forces in the Sinai were not forming any threat to us. We decided to attack them. It was not that they were going to attack us. And look what we ended up with. Now, that was June 1967. What happened? Well, there was a world that paid some attention to international law. And before the rules-based international system was devised, okay? And what did they do? They met at the UN Security Council, and on November 22nd, same year, 1967, they demanded unanimously, the US voting with the majority, they demanded that Israel withdraw from occupied territories. Oh, wow. Now, what did Israel do? They said, make us withdraw. Of course, there was no tooth to it, and the U.S. very quickly acquiesced in the Israelis' violation, with the Israelis paying no heed to this UN Security Council 242. It's very, very simple. Look it up, November 22nd, 1967. Now, have they violated UN resolutions since then? Well, why not? They were never held accountable for 1967. So this is a long history. And the hopeful sign is that partly because of the Russians and the Chinese being joined at the hip and Iran being molded into this, you can call it a sinister nexus, if you will, but from the Palestinian point of view, this is a very hopeful sign. Will Iran do any more than it has so far? I don't think so, unless really provoked. But there's Hezbollah, as I mentioned. They're the Houthis. The Israelis are not going to get off unmarked here. And so long as these students on campuses who are pursuing justice for Palestine, who are against the heinous practice of genocide, and just want to cease fire, want to let trucks with food in, God, who could be against that? Well, here you have the joining of the national security state and academe, okay? The administrators, the presidents of these universities are so dependent not only on wealthy donors, many of them Jewish, but also on the government funding. So when I talk about this new acronym that I dreamed up about 5 years ago, the MICMAT is a Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia think tank complex. So academia is folded into this military industrial complex, just as the media is, in a way that's more strong than ever before. So the academia muckety mucks at the top are willing to round up or call the police in. And as I say, it's ironic that we talk today on the anniversary of the Kent State massacres. That was May 4th, 1970. And I just say once again that what's different this time is not only that demonstrators on campus don't have any personal skin in the game. In that sense, it's altruistic, but also that they have this kind of thing. That's called an iPhone, okay? Now, back in 1970, there were photojournalists, and they captured a lot of the shooting. Four students killed. That one picture of a woman mourning over a dead body of somebody just shot by National Guard police. My God. And that was very powerful. That helped end the Vietnam War. Now, with all kinds of access to social media through vivid images of what's going on in that area, we have a complete difference in volume of what information is available. And I just saw a couple more clips of what's happened to professors at the University of South Illinois. That one in Alabama, in Georgia at Emory University. I mean, these are really, really flagrant disregard of all manner of rights. Police taking professors to the ground and beating one up to the point where he was in danger of being killed. Somebody is going to be killed pretty soon. And I don't favor that, of course, but this will be another little spark to ignite what could be a widespread revolution among people. Well, how do you describe it? People who care about other people, okay? People who care about people on the other side of the world, people unknown to us in Gaza, but they're people and they're being decimated. And that's something that good Americans embodied by these protest movements, care about and are willing to make their own sacrifices, put their own bodies on the line, and suffer police brutality in many respects, for demonstrating to people who will film this and get it around that, look, this is what America has become. Police forces trained by the Israelis and how to handle these things. My God, that's what it's come to. It's being revealed now in a way that it never had been before. So it gives me hope. It gives me hope just the bare fact that there are people, that students and people who will come to the campuses, give the students food, give them support, and make this the kind of thing that will last a while until Biden has to fess up or has to figure out what he's going to do. And again, even if it's just out of pure political calculations having to do with the election, maybe he'll see the light, and maybe he'll say, well, there are a lot of young people out there not going to vote for me anymore. Maybe I ought to call Netanyahu up and tell him, knock it off.
Ray, just to wrap up this session, we know that the US House passed a controversial bill that expands definition of anti-Semitism. And what they're trying to do, in your opinion, and how does it affect this type of movements in the United States?
Nima, the Constitution of the United States is the closest you can get to sacred scripture, okay? It's sacrosanct. When I, as a second lieutenant in the United States Army, 1961, swore an oath, it's the only oath that I swear. It was to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, period, end quote. Now, we took that seriously in those days. There are a lot of people around younger than me that take that seriously. And so what we're going to do is emphasize that that's what's at stake here. And of course, we have the Fourth Amendment. That one has to do with privacy. That has to do with illegal searches without a warrant, okay? That has just been reaffirmed in new legislation, made even worse. But the First Amendment, the bedrock of our Constitution, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, is being played fast and loose with. I witness what's going on those campuses. So that's the solution. People need to know what's at stake here. Not only is Julian Assange being held for more than 5 years now in a maximum security prison in London for publishing the truth, the same truth that the New York Times and the Washington Post published, to make an example of him. He has no First Amendment rights, they say. He has no charter to publish items having to do with U.S. war crimes in Iraq or Afghanistan. So yesterday, I guess, was Press Freedom Day. And if you want to see the definition of hypocrisy, giving hypocrisy a bad name, look at the White House spokesman, look at the State Department spokesperson. They're going to tell you about how important it is to make sure that the facts come out so the Americans can know what's going on. So suffice it to say, the First Amendment is basic. And for those who don't know a lot about the American Revolution, let me just tack this on. I learned belatedly, not during my college years, that when the Constitution was being prepared, it was being prepared by a fellow named James Madison and George Mason. George Mason sort of lived about a mile from where I spent 50 years in Arlington, Virginia, okay? What was his claim to fame? Well, he was so erudite, so smart that I tried to figure out, well, where did he go to college? Where did he go to? Oh, did he go to William and Mary like Thomas Jefferson did? You know what the answer was? They go to college. They go to high school. his father drowned in the Potomac River. Okay. He grew up with his uncle, and maybe he was the first homeschooled American. But he read all those books on political philosophy and on theology and politics and everything else. And so when he came to writing a constitution, he was able to draw on all these books. And he and James Madison crafted this wonderful, wonderful instrument securing liberty for us and our posterity. Okay. Now, when Madison finally moved all the levers and got enough people to approve this constitution, he came to George Mason and say, "Thanks so much, George. This is really perfect. So let's go with it." And George Mason, to the astonishment of James Madison, said, "Jim, sorry about this, but I can't sign that. I can't even endorse it." Madison said, "George, you wrote most of it. What's going on here? It doesn't have a Bill of Rights. It doesn't have freedom of speech, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. It doesn't have all the things that will go in disrepair if it's not in the Constitution." Well, they worked out a deal. Madison said, "Look, George, I understand where you're coming from. I'll make you a gentleman's promise. If you just keep quiet about this, all right? I don't want you to advertise how you feel or even make believe that you approve the whole thing. Just keep quiet about it. We'll get the damn thing approved, and then I'll send horsemen up and down the eastern coast. I promise you, George, horsemen up and down the East Coast to get the Bill of Rights approved." Now, in those days, gentlemen made promises and kept them. And that's precisely what happened. And so we got several years later, the Bill of Rights. Now, that Bill of Rights is an integral part of the Constitution. And what's at stake was very clear after the Constitutional Convention when a woman from Pennsylvania, no, she was from Maryland, she came up to Benjamin Franklin and she said, what have you created for us?" And he looked at her in a very serious mien and he said, "Madam, we have created for you a republic if you can keep it." So that's what's at stake here, folks. A republic if we can keep it. And so what's called for here is what Tom Paine during the Revolution called for: winter soldiers, soldiers that are willing to put their bodies into it to defend what we have won, what our forefathers won 250 years ago. A lot is at stake. I think people are coming to realize that now. I like to see young people realizing that, at least what the First Amendment means, and how police, mayors, university presidents do not have the right to annul the First Amendment that George Mason, James Madison, and the other founders worked so hard to put into the Constitution as the Bill of Rights, the first set of amendments. That's what's at stake. And I'm glad to have this chance to explain that for those who aren't or have forgotten some of that early American history. There was despotism here. We rose up against it. We suffered lots of casualties. The few casualties that we might suffer now are certainly worth it, are they not?